Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at some sample questions and answers for part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. The questions we're looking at are on the topic of social media. Something you might not expect to have to talk about when you go into the IELTS speaking test, but again, this is a feature of part 1 of the speaking test. The examiner is going to try and surprise you a little bit with some of the topics that come up, just to kind of check that you have an ability to communicate in English fluently and not just memorize answers before you go into the test. When we look at the answers to this, you'll see that we're using a similar technique to give all 4 of these answers, and it's the kind of technique I'll give students to use when they're answering these types of questions in part 1 of the test. Now, what I want to do first is have a look at the questions and think about exactly what they're asking and what they require of you, and then we'll look at the sample answers after that. After we've looked at the sample answers, I will give a short analysis of those answers and explain why they're the kind of answers that a really high-level student would get. Someone with a really high level of English. Someone who's likely to get a band 9 in the IELTS speaking test. So let's have a look at these 4 questions. Now, the first question you can see here is, which social media websites do you use? So quite a short, simple question. Nothing too difficult there. Of course, you've got to make sure when you answer, you've got to give the websites that you do use. And, well, if you don't use any, well, that's fine. You can just say that you don't use them. Again, with anything here, when you're giving an answer, you need to kind of explain why. If you don't, then the examiner is probably going to ask you. They'll give you a prompt. They will say why. But it's best to answer that first before they do that. So you're giving a kind of 2-sentence clear answer to this type of question. There's really nothing too complex with this type of question. And if we look at the second question here, again, it's a pretty simple question. How much time do you spend on social media sites? So a bit different, but again, here we're talking about the amount of time that we use when we go on these social media sites. Or really, you could talk about how often you use them as well, if you can't think of a whole amount of time. But again, the question is focused on time spent on these types of websites. Again, you just need to give a nice, clear, direct answer and maybe explain a little bit why afterwards. You don't need anything more than just a nice, simple 2-sentence answer here. Let's just have a look at the third question here, and that is, what kind of information about yourself have you put on social media? So a slightly kind of longer question there that you'll have to listen to carefully, but nothing too complicated, right? We've just got to answer, well, the kind of information it is, right? So you really got to give examples there of what is it? What information do you put up online? Well, if it's nothing, then that's fine. You can say nothing and why you put nothing there. But if it is some things, just give examples of what those things are, directly answering that question. And then afterwards, you can give a quick reason why you do or you don't put certain information up on those websites. So there we go. If we move to the fourth and final question, it's, is there anything you don't like about social media? So again, quite a short and simple question there. Slightly different in its style. It's saying, is there? It's an is there question, which means generally we're going to be giving a yes or no answer to start with. But of course, we need to kind of stick to this kind of 2-sentence technique that we can use to give an answer. So you're kind of course, give the things or say the things that you don't like. Now, if there's nothing that you don't like, you could say there's nothing that you don't like about it and explain why. But there's probably some things that you don't like. So you can give an example of the things that you don't like and then explain why you don't like those things. But you can see there with those 4 questions, there's really nothing too complex about the questions, right? You're not asked to kind of give too much explanation or too much detail. There's nothing too complex. In fact, with all of those questions, they're all using the present simple tense. They're not using any kind of ways of asking you to kind of talk about different times or talking about the past, talking about the future. We're just focused on the present here. It's something you won't always see in part one of the IELTS speaking test. Quite often they'll mix up the tenses of the questions to test that you can use different verb tenses. But here it kind of sticks to one tense, the present tense is there. So quite simple. But again, I want to show you these sample answers to the questions that really show kind of a high level answer that kind of, it gives a nice, clear, concise answer that it's the type of answer that a student who would get a very high score would give. So let's have a look at an answer to the first question, which was, which social media websites do you use? I don't really use these types of websites much, but occasionally I'll contact people through Facebook or look at photos on Instagram. I don't really find going on these websites is a good use of my time. How much time do you spend on social media sites? As I said, I don't really like using these sites, so not much time at all. Maybe I'll check Facebook or Instagram a couple of times a week. What kind of information about yourself have you put on social media? Nothing more than the most basic information, like my name, age, and general location. I don't really see the need to share more than that, especially if people I don't know can see it. Is there anything you don't like about social media? Yes, I think people often say things to others on the internet that they wouldn't dream of saying to their face. This has changed the way that some people communicate, and not for the better. Okay, there we go. So you can see there, right? We've stuck to the same plan. We've given kind of nice, clear and concise 2-sentence answers. Shouldn't be anything too complex in those answers that you don't understand really, but what I want to do is just quickly go through the answers and have a look at them again and point out a couple of things that would impress the examiner and could really encourage them to give you quite a high score, or start at least in part one thinking that this student is probably going to get a pretty high band score. So if we look at the answer to the first question, which was, which social media websites do you use? So you can see in this answer, it's, well, a pretty long answer, but that's because we've got 2 quite detailed sentences. You can see in the first sentence, we've started off by saying, well, we don't really use the websites much, right? We don't really use these types of websites much. So we're referring to the social media websites that were mentioned in the question. But we haven't finished yet. That's not a good enough answer, right? We haven't really directly answered the question yet. So we're continuing that sentence and using the word but. But occasionally I'll contact people through Facebook or look at photos on Instagram. So there we go. We've given some examples of 2 websites that we use, Facebook and Instagram. And then after that, we've got a second sentence where we've just explained why we don't really use them much. I don't really find going on these websites is a good use of my time. Nothing too complex there. Maybe some nice collocation that you haven't seen before with the phrasal verb go on with websites. This is a very kind of common collocation to use, to go on a website. Sometimes people are not aware of this, but there we go. Nothing too complex there. It just shows a kind of a good use of general vocabulary related to social media. We moved to the second answer we gave, which was to the question that was asking, how much time do you spend on social media sites? So again, we're kind of answering with the same style here. We're making a little comment and then giving a direct answer. You see here, we even refer to the first answer. We said, as I said, I don't really like using these sites. So we're referring to what we said in the first answer because it relates to this question. Then we've directly answered. So, not much time at all. So there we go. There we go. It said how much time. Well, not much time at all. We need to explain this a bit more, and we have done in the second sentence. Maybe I'll check Facebook or Instagram a couple of times a week. So there we've given kind of a more specific answer there, a couple of times a week. But a full enough answer. You can see it looks quite a lot shorter than the previous one, but it's still that 2-sentence strategy that we're using to answer that question. If we move on to the third answer, to the third question. Now, the third question was, what kind of information about yourself have you put on social media? You can see here we've gone straight into a direct answer there. We're not commenting on it that much. We've just gone straight in. Nothing more than the most basic information. So there we go. That's the direct answer there. The basic information, right? Not too much detail. But then we actually give examples of the specific information we're using. My name, age, and general location. General location meaning that you're going to give details of the city or town or country that you live in, but maybe not your specific address. So that's a nice clear first sentence there where we have answered the question, but then we've explained why a little bit in that second sentence. I don't really see the need to share more than that. That is referring to, well, the 3 things that we mentioned in the first sentence. Then we're given a little bit more detail as well, especially if people I don't know can see it. So there we go. Again, a nice, clear, concise 2-sentence answer. Nothing too complex. Then if we look at the fourth and final answer to that last question, is there anything you don't like about social media? You can see here, the first question starts nice and focused by saying yes. Of course, you could answer with no there. Or if you want, you could answer in a slightly different way. But here we've been nice and direct, kept focused to our first sentence of our answer. Yes is not enough, of course, and you can see we've gone on and explained a bit. I think people often say things to others on the internet that they wouldn't dream of saying to their face. So we can see here we've given the example of something that we don't like, the way people communicate on social media. Sometimes they say things that they wouldn't otherwise say. They wouldn't say it to their face. Of course, we can use we can see the phrase there, to dream of saying something. Now, to dream of saying, it's not actually like we dream at night, or it's also not about things we would like to do in the future here. It's a different use of this vocabulary, which is going to probably impress the examiner a bit here. Now, it just really means you wouldn't imagine, right? You wouldn't even think of saying that to someone's face, which I think is probably quite true for quite a lot of people. But then also we've given a bit more detail in the second sentence. This has changed the way some people communicate, and not for the better. So we think this is a negative development here, which is why we don't like it. It's something that has changed, and it hasn't been really a good change. You can see the phrase there, for the better, which really means, well, it hasn't been an improvement. It's not better than it was in the past. But there we go. Nothing too complex. Again, they're just using those 2 sentences. We can see all of the answers are really there a similar length and using really a very similar technique. In the first sentence, we're giving a nice, clear, concise, direct answer. And then in the second sentence, we're explaining a bit more, giving a reason for the first sentence or our direct answer. Really, in part 1, you don't need to do more than this. You get to show off kind of more kind of speech at length in other parts of the test. In part 2, part 3, you're going to be giving much, much longer answers. In part 1, these are kind of an appropriate length of answer, and it's really going to impress the examiner if you give answers like these. Of course, when we look at these answers, they're error-free. There's no kind of grammatical errors or errors with vocabulary or word choice here. And really, it's just showing off a bit of fluency, that we're able to communicate easily in English, understanding questions clearly, and then giving nice, clear, and concise answers. That's really all we need to do in part 1. But of course, to get better at part 1, you have to be practicing, right? You need to be using this type of technique with other questions, with as many different part 1 questions as you can, and giving nice, clear answers that use this strategy of using a 2-sentence answer. But I hope these answers were helpful to you. That I hope you saw kind of some ways of answering questions in part 1 that are going to help you in the future, in your practice and in the real test. If you did find it useful, then do remember to click the like button. It does help. And also, if you haven't already, remember to click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any similar videos in the future. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you again in the next video.